in the morning than a big glob of chicken gravy.
In the unforgiving world of the Middle Ages, when winter could mean starvation and every crumb was counted, peasant families learned to survive with wisdom.
Girl, this is delicious. This chicken, it just, oh my God.
Grit, and a cellar full of hope. Today, I want to honor those forgotten hands, mothers, fathers, and farmers, who turned the simplest ingredients into lasting nourishment for generations to come. Hardtack. Bite into a piece of hardtack, and you'll swear you're chewing on history itself. Dry as a sermon and twice as long-lasting, this humble slab of flour and water was more than just food. It was survival baked into a brick. Imagine the echoing crunch, the kind that reverberates in your molars and demands a soak in broth or ale before you dare attempt a second bite. It wasn't fancy, but it was faithful. In the cold months when the fields slept and the stew pot held more water than meat, hardtack was often the only thing standing between a family and an empty table. The story of hardtack stretches far beyond peasant kitchens. It was a staple aboard ships, packed into soldiers' rucksacks, and hidden away in the dusty corners of every medieval pantry. In villages where ovens were shared by the community, women would bake massive batches of this toothsome biscuit during the harvest, letting it dry in the low heat of fading coals. It had no leaven, no frills, and no rush to rot. When made right, a biscuit could last for years. Not weeks, not months, years. The recipe was plain-spoken, like the people who relied on it. Just flour, usually coarse ground barley or rye, and water, mixed into a stiff dough and rolled out into thick slabs. Some added a pinch of salt if they had it, but most didn't waste such a precious thing on bread that wasn't meant to delight, only endure. It was baked slow and low, sometimes even baked twice to draw every last drop of moisture from the dough. The result was less a cracker, more a relic. Peasants softened hardtack in warm milk or ale, dropped it into stews to bulk them up, or crumbled it into porridge for a bit of body. It wasn't about flavor, it was about fuel. Even after a year in storage, tucked into linen sacks or wooden chests, it held firm. Mold didn't want it. Mice couldn't chew through it. It simply persisted. In many ways, hardtack was the medieval spirit made edible, tough, enduring, and resourceful. It didn't ask to be loved. It asked to be useful. And in that, it earned its place as one of the most relied on, never-expiring foods of the peasant world. Salted pork. There's something almost reverent about opening a barrel of salted pork. The scent hits first, briny, meaty, a whisper from last autumn's slaughter day. Reach down through the cold, grainy salt and pull out a slab, pinkish, firm, and thick with promise. In the medieval world, salted pork was more than just a preserved meat. It was a symbol of foresight, family labor, and the quiet triumph of preparation over scarcity. For the peasant, pigs were prized not just for their meat, but for their generosity. Every part of the animal had a purpose, from the snout to the tail, and salting was the surest way to stretch that gift across the calendar. When the weather turned cold and the butchering began, the best cuts were packed into wooden barrels with layers upon layers of salt, coarse, gray, and precious. The salt didn't just season the meat, it transformed it. It pulled out moisture, halted spoilage, and locked the pork in a kind of edible stasis. Salted pork was heavy with labor. It took days to pack a barrel right, turning each piece to make sure every side was kissed by salt. The barrels were stored in the coolest, darkest corner of the cottage, or buried halfway into the cellar floor. And once it was there, it could last through the worst of winters, or even two, if needed. When it came time to use it, you didn't just throw it in the pan. No, salted pork demanded patience. First, it had to be soaked, sometimes overnight, to draw out the salt. Then, boiled, sometimes twice, to tenderize it. Only then was it fried, chopped into stews, or served with boiled grains and root vegetables. The fat gave flavor to otherwise bland porridges, and the meat itself, tough though it may be, was treasured like a holiday feast. There was joy in the rare days when salted pork appeared on the table. Children's eyes widened. Elders gave quiet thanks. Even the dog waited a little closer to the hearth. It reminded folks of the harvest just past and gave them hope they'd reach the next one. Salted pork didn't pretend to be elegant, but it carried the weight of winter on its shoulders. It was a cornerstone of peasant food security, practical, sturdy, and quietly luxurious in a world where luxury meant surviving another year. Honey. Golden, thick, and shimmering like sunlight trapped in a jar. Honey was the medieval peasant's miracle food. It was sweetness in a world where sugar was unheard of, a rare indulgence that also happened to heal wounds, soothe throats, and never, ever spoil. Even after centuries sealed in clay pots, Honey stays as it was, smooth, floral, and ready to stir into a steaming cup of herb tea or smear on coarse black bread. Beekeeping in the Middle Ages wasn't just a hobby, it was a sacred task. Hives were tended with care and superstition, often passed down through generations. Bees were considered wise, almost holy creatures. Folks believed they needed to be spoken to during births and funerals, lest they grow offended and abandon the hive. And why not? A single hive could yield the only sweetener for miles and provide a substance more valuable than gold at times. For peasants lucky enough to keep bees, or know someone who did, honey was stored carefully in ceramic crocks or glass jars when they could get them. It lived in pantries and cellars, far from heat or damp, though truthfully, it barely needed protecting. Honey is naturally antimicrobial, resisting mold, rot, and time itself. Some even say it was the food of the gods. But for a humble family, it was the difference between a bland meal and a special one. It found its way into everything. Mixed with vinegar, it made a tart, sweet glaze for meats. Stirred into gruel, it made breakfast feel like a feast. Some women baked it into cakes or little oat rounds for feast days. When illness struck, it was rubbed on burns, used to treat coughs, or simply licked from a spoon like a tonic. And for those with access to a bit of wild yeast, honey became mead, the drink of poets, monks, and merry nights by the hearth. Even when it crystallized, honey never truly spoiled. A quick warming, and it flowed like amber all over again. In a time where nearly everything had a season or an expiration, honey felt eternal. It was a sweet constant in the rhythm of hunger and harvest, feast and famine. More than just a food, honey was a symbol of nature's generosity, of quiet luxury, and of survival with a touch of sweetness. And in that sticky gold, peasants found not just flavor, but hope. Dried beans. Shake a sack of dried beans and you can hear the promise of a dozen meals, rattling like tiny drums of survival. Speckled, pale, or dark as rich soil, these little pods held the kind of quiet magic only a medieval peasant could fully appreciate. Simple, filling, endlessly versatile, and nearly immortal, dried beans were the backbone of countless suppers from cottage to croft. In the medieval world, where meat was scarce and coins were scarcer, beans stepped up as the humble hero. They grew well in poor soil, restored nutrients to the earth, and produced heavily with just a little care. From garden rows to forest edges, peasants planted beans in summer's warmth and harvested them before the frost, stringing pods to dry by the hearth or laying them out on thatched rooftops to soak up the last of the sun. Once dried, beans transformed into something else entirely, no longer tender green bites, but hard, shell-like tokens of nourishment. Packed in linen sacks or clay jars, they could last through bitter winters, across poor harvest years, and even into the next generation's pantry. As long as they were kept dry and cool, beans outlived the very seasons. And oh, how they filled the pot. Toss a handful into a bubbling cauldron with onion, herbs, and maybe a scrap of salted pork or cabbage, and you had a meal that stuck to your ribs and softened the edge of hunger. Cooked long and slow, the beans bloomed into creamy morsels that turned simple broth into a meal. They showed up in everything: pottages, pastes, even baked into humble pies when meat was just a memory. Beans were not just food. They were a kind of edible insurance. Families often measured their security by the size of their bean stores. Mothers taught daughters how to sort and soak them. Fathers turned them over in their hands like seeds of hope. And come spring, any extras were saved for planting, because beans beget beans in nature and in the rhythm of rural life. No fanfare, no delicate flavor notes, just honest sustenance with a long shelf life and an even longer history. They didn't spoil, didn't rot, and didn't ask for much. In return, they gave warmth, fullness, and just enough strength to carry a family through the leaner days. Dried beans were more than food. They were continuity in a world that changed too fast, and comfort in a bowl on the coldest nights. Lentils. Lentils may not look like much at first glance. Flat, tiny discs in shades of earth from dusty green to rust red, but don't let their modest appearance fool you. These were the quiet champions of the medieval pantry, hardy little seeds with the strength to outlast time, hunger, and even war. To a medieval peasant, lentils were more than a food. They were a comfort, a staple, and sometimes a saving grace. They stored like coins, each one a promise of nourishment. When properly dried, lentils could keep for years in nothing more than a linen sack or earthen jar. Tucked into corners of root cellars and high shelves in smoky kitchens, they waited patiently for the call to service. No spoilage, no fuss. In times of famine, when turnips rotted and grains molded, lentils remained. That kind of dependability was more precious than gold. Cultivated since ancient times, lentils were already old news by the Middle Ages, but they were never taken for granted. They grew quickly, didn't ask much of the soil, and produced generously. For peasant families scraping by on limited land, that made them an ideal crop. And once harvested, they became an anchor for countless humble meals. You didn't need much to make them shine, just a pot, some water, and maybe a scrap of onion or dried herb. Cooked into thick pottages or mashed with garlic and vinegar, lentils gave a silky richness that other legumes couldn't match. On fast days, those many meatless days imposed by church law, they became even more important, standing in for the flesh that was forbidden. And in monastic kitchens and peasant hearths alike, they were often seen as a food both holy and humble. Even the folklore surrounding lentils speaks to their quiet dignity. Some believed they symbolized thrift, others saw them as a sign of wisdom. And it makes sense. There's something wise about a food that lasts forever, nourishes deeply, and grows without fuss. Lentils didn't need to be center stage. They knew their worth. They didn't spoil, didn't sour, and didn't draw pests the way flour or fruit might. As long as they were kept dry and away from damp, they kept indefinitely, always ready to rise to the occasion. Whether cooked soft in a thick stew or pressed into patties over a fire, lentils brought warmth and fullness to the medieval table. In every bowl, there was more than food. There was endurance. And in every mouthful, a quiet, sustaining power that outlasted the ages. Saltfish. Crack open the lid of a wooden barrel and there it is, saltfish, stiff as parchment and sharp with the smell of brine and sea wind. It's not pretty, and it sure isn't tender, not yet, but to a medieval peasant, it was a treasure. Preserved fish, especially cod or herring, was a lifeline through the long, cold months when fresh meat vanished, rivers froze, and fields lay bare under frost. Fish had a sacred place in medieval life, not just on the table, but in the calendar. With dozens of fasting days each year where meat was forbidden by church decree, saltfish became a spiritual and culinary necessity. It made the rounds from monasteries to manor kitchens and into the hearths of peasants who may have only eaten meat a few times a year, but found fish to be an acceptable, if tough, substitute. The preservation process was as much ritual as it was recipe. Fresh-caught cod, mackerel, or herring was gutted, cleaned, and packed in layers of coarse salt, sometimes laid out on wooden racks to dry beneath the sun, or smoke-cured over a low fire. In coastal villages, long ropes of fish hung like laundry from lines, stiffening in the sea air. Inland, barrels of saltfish were traded for grain, ale, or wool, a valuable commodity that traveled well and lasted near indefinitely. Once cured, saltfish became an ironclad staple. It could be stored for months, years even, without spoiling, and no rat or mouse dared sink its teeth into something so dry and uninviting. But when prepared with care and patience, it transformed. First, it had to be soaked, often for hours or overnight, to draw out the salt and bring back a semblance of tenderness. Then boiled, stewed, or fried with onions, herbs, or bits of root vegetable. It wasn't indulgent, but it was hearty, filling, and respected. For many peasants, especially those living near rivers or along trade routes, saltfish was one of the few reliable sources of protein throughout the year. It might be served on a slab of coarse bread, flaked into a thick pottage, or eaten plain on Lenten days with a prayer and a sigh. It had weight. It had purpose. Saltfish reminded people of the sea's bounty and the human ability to bend time through salt and fire. In a world with no refrigeration, it was a marvel, practical, portable, and nearly eternal. Fermented sauerkraut. Lift the lid on an old oak barrel tucked away in a dark corner of a medieval cellar, and you'll catch the unmistakable tang, sharp, briny, earthy. It's sauerkraut, still bubbling faintly if it's young, or settled into a gentle sourness if it's aged. This wasn't just cabbage anymore. It was transformation in a barrel, humble greenery turned alchemy through time, salt, and the invisible magic of fermentation. For medieval peasants, cabbage was one of the few crops that laughed in the face of winter. It grew big and stubborn in the fall, with leaves so thick they squeaked when handled. But fresh cabbage didn't last long in the cold. It would freeze or rot in a heartbeat. So clever hands and old wisdom turned to the ancient art of fermentation, packing shredded cabbage with salt into large wooden casks, pressing it down with stones, and leaving nature to do the rest. The process was deceptively simple, just cabbage and salt. No vinegar, no starter cultures, no fuss. Salt drew out the liquid, forming a brine, and wild bacteria, friendly ones, the kind that liked the cold, went to work. Days passed, then weeks. What came out of that process was sharp, preserved, and oddly refreshing. More than that, it was medicine in disguise. Long before folks knew about vitamins or gut flora, they understood that kraut kept the belly settled, the appetite sharp, and the winter sickness at bay. It was more than a side dish. Sauerkraut became a flavor booster for everything from thick barley gruels to boiled meats. It was spooned over roasted roots, stirred into dumplings, or eaten straight from the crock with rough black bread and cold ale. On days when pickings were slim and spirits lower, a bite of kraut was like a slap awake, tangy, alive, and crackling with preserved sunlight. It kept for months, even years, if stored right. As long as the brine covered the cabbage and no mold took hold, it would remain safe and sour through the longest winter. Travelers carried small amounts in pouches. Monks swore by it. And in peasant kitchens, the scent of kraut fermenting became as familiar as firewood smoke or the creak of the floorboards. Fermented sauerkraut was more than thrift. It was proof of patience, of old-world know-how that didn't need labels or expiration dates. In a world where freshness faded fast, this tangy marvel held its ground and kept holding through frost, famine, and time itself. Onions. Step into a medieval kitchen and glance upward. There, hanging like braided trophies from the rafters, are strings of onions, golden, white, and sometimes purple, swaying gently in the hearth-warmed air. Their papery skins rustle like whispers from last autumn's harvest, and their scent lingers everywhere, sharp, sweet, and deeply familiar. Onions weren't just an ingredient. They were a necessity, a charm, and a promise that even the poorest meal would have flavor. The beauty of the onion lies in its resilience. Planted in spring and pulled before the first frost, onions could be stored for months with almost no effort. Braided together by the dozens and hung in cool, dry places, they defied rot and ruin with quiet pride. Even the soft ones, long past their peak, were cooked down into stews and pottages, their flavor mellowed into golden sweetness. Nothing was wasted, nothing dared be. For peasants, onions were the gateway to taste. Most meals began with a bit of lard or fat in a pot, and then in went the chopped onion, sizzling, spitting, giving its all. Its scent meant supper was on the way. It was used in everything: thick stews, barley broths, lentil pastes, and even as a seasoning on its own when salt ran low. A single onion could bring life to a whole cauldron of thin soup. But onions weren't just practical. They were believed to carry power. Hung over doors to ward off illness, slipped into satchels for protection, and even buried with the dead in older traditions. Folklore whispered that onions could keep the evil eye away, cure fevers, or reveal the coming weather. Whether those stories held truth or not didn't matter. The onion offered more than food. It gave a sense of security, both spiritual and culinary. And unlike delicate herbs or temperamental greens, onions didn't complain. They grew in poor soil. They didn't beg for rain. They kept through the deepest winter and were always ready to give their bite to whatever was cooking. They didn't spoil easily and, when dried properly, could be eaten months, even a year, after harvest. In a world where nearly every ingredient came and went with the seasons, onions stood firm. They gave peasant meals their soul and their scent, lingering in the cracks of cottage walls and woven into the stories passed down through generations. The onion asked for little and gave much, and for that, it earned a permanent place in the medieval larder and in the memory of every table it graced. Garlic. Garlic didn't just flavor the pot, it haunted the room. That sharp, earthy perfume could fill a cottage from rafter to floorboard, clinging to aprons and settling into wood grain. To the medieval peasant, garlic was pungent proof that even the smallest clove could change everything. It was medicine, magic, and meal maker, all bundled up in a papery bulb that refused to rot. Like its cousin, the onion, garlic grew low to the ground and asked for little. It thrived in hard soil, weathered drought, and came up quietly when spring rolled back the frost. Once pulled and dried under the sun, the bulbs were braided into long ropes and strung from ceiling beams like garlands of survival. Each clove held tight to its strength, powerful in smell, sharp in taste, and shockingly durable. Some bulbs would last nearly a year, dried and tucked into a corner of the kitchen, always on standby. In daily cooking, garlic worked miracles. A smashed clove tossed into the cauldron turned water and grain into something with character. Fried gently in lard, it gave roots and beans a bite. Rubbed on rough brown bread, it created the simplest peasant feast imaginable: bread, garlic, and a mug of weak ale. It was a poor man's seasoning, but also perhaps his armor. Folklore clung to garlic as tightly as its paper skins. People believed it warded off sickness, demons, and even death. Mothers tucked cloves under mattresses to keep fevers at bay. Travelers carried it in pouches for protection. Some hung it over doors beside onions and wild herbs to guard the home. Whether you believed in its magic or not, one thing was certain: garlic was as close to medicine as most peasants ever got. It preserved beautifully. resisting spoilage far longer than most crops. Dried, roasted, or pickled in vinegar, garlic remained edible and potent through long winters and longer lean seasons. When meats were rank or stews were thin, garlic masked the truth and added boldness. And when sickness swept through the village, it was chopped raw and eaten by the brave, in hopes its strength would transfer. In a world ruled by bland necessity, garlic was defiance. It didn't whisper, it shouted, and yet it asked for nothing in return. Just a spot in the soil, a little sun, and a place in the larder. Garlic was more than flavor. It was folklore and fire, tucked in every peasant's rafters, ready to bring boldness to even the bleakest meal. Hard cheese. There's a particular satisfaction in slicing into a wheel of aged cheese, the kind that sat quietly in a cool cellar for months, even years, gathering flavor like stories in silence. It resists the knife at first, then gives way with a crumble and a scent that's nutty, sharp, and faintly of the barn where it all began. Hard cheese was the peasant's secret luxury, compact, nourishing, and practically eternal when made with care. Unlike fresh cheese, which spoiled in days and was best eaten still warm from the curdling pot, hard cheese was built to last. The process began with raw milk, usually from cows or goats, left to curdle with rennet from a calf's stomach or a wild herb like thistle. The curds were pressed, salted, and then left to age, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes rubbed with oil or ash, and tucked away in a cellar so cool and steady you could forget what season it was. Over weeks and months, the cheese hardened, its moisture faded, its flavors deepened. What started as a soft curd became a firm, dense wheel that could feed a family in slivers and shavings for half a year. And once aged properly, it didn't spoil, it simply matured, cracking along the rind and intensifying in aroma. The drier it got, the longer it kept. In some cases, cheese made in autumn could still be edible when spring flowers returned. Hard cheese was more than a meal, it was a binder. Crumbled into soups, grated over root vegetables, or eaten plain with a hunk of bread, it gave richness where there was none. A good cheese made everything else taste better, and in a world of turnips and oats, that was saying something. Even the smallest amount went a long way. A thumb-sized wedge could flavor a whole pot. A rind, scraped clean of mold, could simmer and stew to lend its essence before being fished out and nibbled. Cheese gave protein and fat to a diet heavy with grains and legumes. And in monasteries, where meat was forbidden for long stretches, cheese became a sacred loophole, a kind of dairy salvation. Stored in crocks, wrapped in linen or waxed with tallow, hard cheese didn't ask for much, but gave plenty. It was quiet wealth, tucked away behind cellar doors, aging patiently while the world outside howled with wind and worry. For the medieval peasant, hard cheese wasn't just food, it was preservation in practice, and a little bite of abundance in leaner times. Ale. In a world where water couldn't always be trusted, ale was the drink of choice, from dawn till dusk, for children and elders alike. Not the strong, bitter pint you might picture today, but a mild, nourishing brew, closer to liquid bread than booze. Thick with grain and low in alcohol, medieval ale was a daily essential, brewed fresh, consumed quickly, and revered as one of the safest things you could put in your mouth. Ale started with grain, barley, oats, sometimes wheat, soaked in water, left to sprout, then dried and crushed into malt. That malt was mixed with hot water in large wooden tubs, stirred until it released its sweet, earthy sugars. From there, it was boiled with herbs or bittering agents like bog myrtle or yarrow, long before hops came into regular use. Once cooled, the brew was left to ferment with wild yeasts, or whatever old ale had been saved from the last batch. Within a few days, it was ready to drink. It was cloudy, warm, and often chunky with sediment, but it was food and drink all in one. Ale filled the belly, soothed the nerves, and added flavor to otherwise dull days. And because the brewing process involved boiling, it was safer than most water sources, which were often contaminated by animals, waste, or worse. Even small children drank weak ale, sometimes called small beer, instead of water. It wasn't just a beverage, it was survival in a mug. Households brewed their own in great cauldrons, the air filling with that sweet, toasty scent of fermenting grain. Women especially were the brewmasters of the home, their ale known and prized in the village. A good alewife was as respected as a fine baker or a skilled midwife. Some even sold their surplus to neighbors, marking their doors with a sprig of broom to signal a fresh batch was ready. Ale didn't last long, it was meant to be drunk within days, but the ingredients could be stored and brewed year-round, and when it went flat or sour, it could still be used in cooking or fed to pigs. Nothing went to waste. Ale was poured over stale bread to make pottage, used to soften hardtack, or drunk alongside a hunk of cheese for the midday meal. It was warmth in winter, refreshment in summer, and comfort at the end of a long day's toil in the fields. Not just a drink, but a part of life's rhythm. Ale wasn't an indulgence, it was a staple. And for the medieval peasant, it was proof that even in hard times, a little bit of fermentation could go a long way. Barley flour. Run your hands through a sack of barley flour and you'll feel the grit of resilience. Soft, yes, but coarser than wheat. And just humble enough to remind you it came from harder ground. In medieval kitchens, barley flour was as common as the morning chill, a dusty lifeline stored in bins and barrels, used in nearly everything that filled a hungry belly. It was grain for the people, tough, reliable, and proud to serve. Wheat might have ruled the manorial feast, but barley was the peasant's grain. It grew where other crops failed, needed less fuss, and ripened fast. While nobles dined on fine white loaves, peasants baked their barley into flatbreads, bannocks, and rough hearth cakes. And though it lacked the airy crumb of refined wheat, barley made up for it in hardiness. It was sturdy food, the kind that filled a stomach and stuck to the bones. The flour was made by grinding dried barley, sometimes toasted for extra flavor, on hand-turned cornstones, the same way it had been done for centuries. The resulting meal was darker, flecked with bits of husk, and slightly sweet with a nutty edge. Stored in earthen crocks or cloth sacks, it kept remarkably well in cool, dry places. As long as moisture and vermin were kept at bay, a sack of barley flour could outlast the season, and then some. It was a chameleon in the kitchen. Mixed with water and a pinch of salt, it made simple doughs that could be cooked on hot stones. Thickened into porridge with milk or ale, it made a warm, filling breakfast. Stirred into soups, it added bulk. It even stood in for batter when frying up scraps of root or meat. Barley flour was never flashy, but it worked quietly in the background, giving weight and warmth to the meal. And when other grains ran scarce, after a bad harvest or during hard winters, barley stepped up. It didn't mind being stretched thin, mixed with acorns or peas or chestnut flour to make the stores last. It kept families fed when wheat was only a rumor. No one sang songs about barley flour, but maybe they should have. It was the flour that fed the plowman, the herder, the spinner at her wheel. It made the bread for journeying monks and the dumplings in the poor man's stew. In every sack, a quiet promise. We'll eat tomorrow. Barley flour was nourishment, plain and unpretentious, but in its grainy hands, it held the future. Oats. Oats were the morning call of the medieval countryside. Before the rooster crowed, before the sun crept over frost-covered fields, a pot of oats was already simmering over the hearth, thick, lumpy, and steaming like breath on a cold pane. To the medieval peasant, oats weren't just breakfast. They were bedrock, dependable, durable, and deeply filling. Unlike wheat, which demanded rich soil and a gentle climate, oats were rugged. They thrived in rain-soaked highlands and wind-bitten pastures, growing where little else dared. Scotland, Ireland, northern England. These places embraced oats like kin, and for good reason. The grain yielded generously, matured quickly, and could be harvested even in the stubborn chill of autumn. Once dried and hulled, the oats were ground or left whole, stored in sacks, and brought out with the regularity of dawn. They kept splendidly, months on end, even years if kept cool and dry. Rodents didn't love them the way they loved wheat, and mold was less a threat thanks to the low moisture content. Oats were a storage dream, tucked into earthen jars or linen sacks in the pantry, always waiting to be called into service. Most days, they were made into porridge, a peasant's morning ritual. Just oats, water, or milk, maybe a pinch of salt or a drizzle of honey if fortune smiled. It wasn't glamorous, but it was warm and honest. And it could stretch. Oh, could it stretch? A handful of oats could feed a family, especially when stirred slowly to thicken and puff. But oats were more than porridge. They were baked into flat oatcakes over stones, or mixed with fat and bits of dried fruit when available. They thickened stews, bound meat scraps into dumplings, or were pressed into simple pastes with garlic and vinegar. For animals, too, especially horses, oats were feed and fuel. What the land gave, the peasants used, top to bottom. They were also tied to old tales and folk customs. Some believed that sowing oats before the first thaw would bring fertility to the land. Others used oat straw for bedding or braided it into charms. There was a deep familiarity to oats, a comfort in their presence that went beyond just food. Oats didn't spoil, they didn't fade. They just waited, sturdy and solemn, ready to fill another bowl, another belly. In every bite there was warmth, thrift, and the reassurance that no matter how lean the larder, breakfast could still be made. Walnuts and hazelnuts. There's a sound to autumn in the medieval countryside, the soft patter of nuts dropping into dry leaves, followed by the eager scurry of hands collecting them. Walnuts and hazelnuts weren't just snacks. They were small treasures from the trees, gifts wrapped in husk and shell, tucked away in sacks and baskets for the long months ahead. In a world without supermarkets or imported oils, these humble nuts were fat, flavor, and fortune. Come September, families would comb the woods and hedgerows, children in tow, gathering what they could. Hazelnuts clung to low bushes, tucked inside leafy frills like nature's own packaging. Walnuts hung high and stubborn, often knocked down with poles or shaken loose with patience and a good breeze. Once gathered, they were laid out to dry on wooden boards or stone floors, the air rich with that nutty, tannic scent of fall. Properly dried and stored in cool, dry spaces, these nuts could last through winter and beyond. Their hard shells sealed them off from air and damp, making them one of the most reliable and storable food sources available. Even after a year in the larder, a walnut could still offer up its rich, oily heart with a satisfying crack. And oh, the uses. A handful of crushed hazelnuts stirred into porridge gave it texture and depth. Walnuts pounded with garlic and vinegar made a kind of peasant sauce, tangy, rich, and perfect for cold greens or root vegetables. When meat was scarce, nuts provided fat. When spirits were low, they offered crunch and richness. Some clever hands even pressed them for oil, though the yield was small and the labor high. They were more than food. They were currency in bartering, tokens of hospitality, even part of bridal dowries. In folklore, nuts symbolized wisdom and fertility. Children cracked them by the hearth for treats. Monks ground them into pastes during Lenten fasts. And on feast days, they might even be candied in honey, a rustic confection that felt like pure indulgence. Walnuts and hazelnuts were nature's ration packs, hearty and dense with nutrition. They didn't spoil, they didn't freeze. They simply waited, year after year, for calloused hands to split them open and reveal their buttery gold. In the hands of the medieval peasant, these nuts weren't just food. They were patience made edible, proof that the forest still looked out for those who knew where to look. Smoked sausages. In the dead of winter, when the wind howled through chinks in the wall and the earth was locked in frost, the sight of a loop of smoked sausage hanging from the rafters was a balm to the soul. Dark, wrinkled, and curled like sleeping snakes above the hearth. These sausages weren't just meat. They were memories of autumn's plenty, preserved by smoke and salt, and the hope that spring would come again. Sausage making wasn't just about flavor. It was about survival. Every autumn, during the traditional slaughtering time known as Martinmas, families came together to butcher pigs and preserve every last morsel. The best cuts were salted or packed in lard, but the trimmings, bits of shoulder, scraps of fat, organ meats, were chopped, seasoned, and stuffed into cleaned intestines to make sausages. It was a full-day affair, sometimes more, with generations gathered around wooden tables, grinding, mixing, filling. Then came the smoke. The sausages were hung in low, warm smokehouses or near the kitchen fire, suspended over gentle, smoldering embers of beech, oak, or apple wood. Day by day, the smoke curled around them, seeping into the meat, driving out moisture, and layering it with flavor and protection. What emerged weeks later was tough, rich, and nearly indestructible. Smoked sausages could last for months, even into the next summer if kept dry and cool. They became a portable, reliable food that traveled well and spoiled slowly. Peasants sliced them thin to flavor pottages, fried them with cabbage or beans, or nibbled them cold with a hunk of bread during long days in the fields. A little went a long way. The flavor was bold, smoky, salty, sometimes spicy with pepper or garlic if such luxuries were on hand. In some regions, wild herbs or even dried berries were added. Every village had its own recipe, passed down in whispers and practiced by muscle memory. And because sausages used every part of the animal, they embodied the peasant spirit. Nothing wasted, everything honored. Even the casing, scraped and rinsed clean, was a testament to thrift and tradition. More than just food, smoked sausages were a declaration of preparation, of family labor, of making plenty last through scarcity. In the still, dark days of February, when fresh food was a memory, a single slice of smoked sausage sizzling in the pan was enough to lift a household's spirits. It was the past preserved by fire and time, and it hung patiently above the hearth, waiting to be needed. Apples, dried or cellared. There's a kind of magic to biting into an apple in the heart of winter. When snow coats the fields, the trees are skeletal, and the orchards sleep. That crisp snap, that burst of tart sweet juice, it feels like cheating time. But for the medieval peasant, that magic wasn't luck. It was wisdom, passed down in the art of storing and preserving one of nature's most generous gifts. Come late summer and early fall, apple trees groaned with fruit. Not the uniform waxed kind we know today, but all shapes and sizes. Some squat and sweet, others sharp enough to pucker your lips. Families gathered them by the bushel, filling baskets and crates with the knowledge that not a single one could afford to go to waste. The first to go were the softest and ripest, eaten fresh or pressed into cider. But the firm, thick-skinned apples, the keepers, were sorted carefully. Wrapped in straw, stored in barrels or wooden bins, they were stacked in cool cellars or barn lofts with care. Apples stored this way could last for months, even into early spring, their flavor mellowing, their flesh softening slightly, but still delicious. Each one was turned and checked regularly because one rotten apple could indeed spoil the whole bunch. Then there were the dried apple, thin slices strung on twine or laid on cloth near the hearth, their sweetness concentrating as they shriveled in the warmth. These leathery rings were packed into sacks and jars, ready to be rehydrated in stews or eaten as is like candy from the gods. A spoonful of dried apple stirred into a grain pottage gave it a bright, fruity lift. Mixed with onions and a bit of vinegar, they became a relish. On feast days, they might even be baked into a rustic pie, sweetened with honey if fortune allowed. Apples were also medicine in disguise. Their fiber kept the belly happy, and their tartness helped balance richer meats. Folk remedies recommended them for coughs, digestion, and even melancholy. And in the depths of winter, just holding one, a little round reminder of warmer days, was enough to lift the spirit. Whether dried or cellared, apples were a tether to the harvest long after the trees had gone bare. They didn't just endure, they comforted. In the cold silence of February, when the pantry looked bare and the ground was still stone hard, an apple was more than food. It was a bite of memory. Turnips. The turnip doesn't ask for applause, it doesn't shine like honey, doesn't perfume the kitchen like herbs, and never gets a place of honor at the table. But in the medieval world, the turnip was a quiet champion, thick-skinned, soil-scented, and stubborn in all the right ways. When the larder grew thin and the days short, turnips were still there, patient and unchanged beneath layers of straw in the cellar. These hardy roots grew when other crops gave up. They laughed at frost, pushing through rocky soil with a kind of grim determination. Sown in summer and pulled in the chill of late autumn, turnips didn't rot easily and didn't complain. They were stored whole, sometimes just buried in sand or laid on cellar floors between layers of hay. Their purple shoulders and creamy bodies nestled like eggs in a nest. When kept cool and dry, a good turnip could last through the entirety of winter and into early spring. The flesh was firm, the flavor sharp and earthy, sometimes bitter, sometimes sweet, depending on the age and the cook. And though it wasn't a vegetable that drew joy from a child's face, it filled bellies. That was enough. Turnips were boiled, roasted, mashed, grated, and stewed. They were cooked into thick pottages, used to bulk out barley broth, or eaten plain with salt and a bit of butter, if there was any to be had. Their greens, too, were saved and used when fresh. Nothing went to waste. In hard times, a peasant could live for weeks on turnips and nothing else. Not because they wanted to, but because the turnip, humble as it was, would still be edible when everything else had withered, spoiled, or disappeared beneath the snow. And for all its plainness, the turnip could surprise you. When roasted near the fire, its bitterness softened, and a subtle sweetness emerged. A good cook could coax a kind of reluctant charm from it. Turnips weren't celebrated, but they were depended upon. They were the foot soldier of the medieval pantry, common, sturdy, and always ready. Folk tales rarely mention them, and no feast song was ever sung in their honor. But in the coldest months, it was often turnips that kept hunger at bay and hope on the table. In a world without guarantees, the turnip offered one. It would last, it would feed, and it would be there when spring was still too far away to believe in. Carrots, white and purple. Before orange became the rule, carrots came in quiet shades, creamy white, dusty purple, even pale yellow. They were crooked, knobby, and sometimes more root than elegance, but in the medieval peasant's pantry, they were a blessing pulled from the dirt. Carrots didn't sing the loudest, but they stayed the longest, tucked beneath the ground or buried in sand where they kept their freshness through the deep months of cold and hunger. Grown with little fuss, carrots were a favorite of cottage gardens and small plots, where space was tight and soil was stingy. They were seeded in summer, their feathery green tops waving like banners over stubborn soil, and harvested before the frost could sweeten them too much. The early varieties didn't taste like the sugar-sweet roots we know today. They were earthier, more herbaceous, sometimes even spicy, with a flavor that needed coaxing. Once pulled, carrots were sorted and stored with care. The best were packed in wooden crates layered with sand or straw and stashed in cellars or sheds where the temperature stayed just right, not too cold, not too warm. This simple method kept them firm and fresh for months. There they'd sit, patient and waiting. their bright colors dulled but their value undiminished. When the bread was stale and the salted pork was long gone, carrots brought texture and color to the pot. They thickened stews, lent sweetness to porridge, and softened into golden ribbons when stewed with onions and herbs. Raw, they were grated into salads or eaten whole like a cold, fibrous snack, simple but sustaining. And when cooked down with dried apples and honey on feast days, they even flirted with the idea of dessert. Carrots were flexible, easily dried in thin slices near the hearth, preserved in brine, or even fermented in small batches when folks were feeling experimental. But their best trick was just being themselves, keeping well, feeding many, and growing back again when the earth warmed. They were not noble food, not celebrated or rare, but they were reliable. Carrots taught patience, rewarded care, and reminded every peasant that the earth, though stingy, could be generous in its own rough way. In the lean months, a pot of carrots bubbling on the fire was more than a meal. It was a quiet reassurance that something had lasted, something had endured, and spring would come again. Cabbage. Stout, crinkled, and smelling just a little too earthy for polite company, cabbage was the unsung queen of the medieval garden. When everything else had withered or gone soft with rot, the cabbage still stood firm, green or purple, tightly wrapped like a secret, and stubborn as winter itself. To the medieval peasant, cabbage wasn't just a vegetable. It was a survival strategy wrapped in leafy layers. Come late autumn, the cabbages were pulled from the fields and hauled into cottages and cellars like squat little trophies. The best heads, firm, dense, and unblemished, were kept whole. They were nestled into straw beds in root cellars or cool corners, where they might last for several months if left undisturbed. The outer leaves would yellow and peel, sure, but inside, still crisp, still edible, still enough to fill a pot. The rest, those bruised, softer, or already starting to wilt, were chopped and salted down into sauerkraut or stewed straight away. Cabbage was too precious to waste. It was one of the few vegetables hardy enough to laugh at frost, and one of the only fresh greens a peasant might see in the depths of winter. In the pot, cabbage was everywhere. It bulked out soups and pottages, turned watery broths into meals, and softened around bits of smoked meat, onion, or garlic. Stewed long enough, it became silk. Fried quickly, it added chew and tang. When dried, it could be rehydrated into a rough version of its former self. Still filling, still worthy. And when fermented, it became sauerkraut, a story unto itself. There was something almost noble in cabbage's humility. It wasn't a rare delight, but it was dependable. It filled the garden with its wide, waxy leaves. It filled the cellar with its staying power, and it filled bellies with something warm when the rest of the plate looked bleak. Even the stalks and outer leaves went to the pigs, or when need was great, into the pot. Folks told tales of cabbage curing colds, purifying the blood, even guarding against drunkenness if eaten before ale. Whether it worked or not hardly mattered. It was green when the world was brown and gray. That alone gave it a kind of magic. Cabbage may never have turned heads, but it held its own in every hearth and every season. It was the kitchen's anchor, a leafy promise that something fresh, something solid, could be coaxed from the soil and still be there, months later, when the world outside had frozen. Lard. It may not look like much, white, creamy, plain, but lard was liquid gold in a medieval peasant's kitchen. It glistened in clay pots and tin crocks, soft and rich, waiting by the hearth like a trusted friend. In a world where butter was rare and oil was a distant dream, lard was the fat that fed the hungry, sealed the precious, and brought flavor to the otherwise flavorless. It was the essence of thrift turned edible. Lard came from the pig, the same pig that gave sausages, salted hams, and pork shoulders. But the fat was something special. Rendered slowly over a low fire, the chunks of back fat or belly were melted down, the cracklings strained off, and what remained was smooth white lard. It cooled thick and spreadable, and unlike fresh meat or dairy, it kept remarkably well, especially when stored in cool places or sealed beneath its own layer. Peasant families rendered lard during the annual slaughter, pouring it hot into jars or crocks and covering it tightly. It would sit on the pantry shelf or in the cellar, waiting quietly for its moment. And when winter took hold and the meals turned lean, lard stepped in. It was used to fry onions, coat vegetables, or crisp up flatbreads on a griddle. A spoonful added to a pot of beans turned it rich. Spread on stale bread with a pinch of salt, it became an impromptu feast. But lard wasn't just food. It was preservation. Leftover meat could be stored submerged in lard, protected from air and rot in a method now known as confit. In some households, it was used to seal the tops of jars, coating pickled vegetables or cooked stews to keep them from spoiling. Its utility went beyond the kitchen, too. It was rubbed into boots to waterproof them, used in salves, and even in candle making when tallow ran low. What made lard truly special was its staying power. When kept properly, cool and covered, it could last for months. No refrigeration needed, just a bit of shade and a place out of the sun. And because it was so versatile, a good supply of lard meant flexibility in the kitchen, something peasants prized more than any spice. It may not have had the glamour of honey or the poetry of ale, but lard was the quiet strength of the medieval larder. Unassuming, indispensable, and always ready to turn the simplest meal into something satisfying. Vinegar. Sharp enough to wake the tongue and stubborn enough to last through seasons of neglect, vinegar was the unsung alchemist of the medieval pantry. In a world without refrigeration, vinegar was how peasants fought back against spoilage, boredom, and the slow creep of rot. It was tart, tangy, and endlessly useful. Poured, splashed, soaked, and stirred into just about everything except breakfast. Vinegar didn't need to be made, it just happened. Leave a jug of ale or wine sitting out too long, and nature did the rest. Wild bacteria turned the leftover drink sour and sharp, and suddenly you had something new, a liquid that could preserve, flavor, and clean. For peasants, vinegar was often homemade, intentionally or not, from the dregs of homemade ale or cider gone off. What some might have thrown away, the wise kept, and were better off for it. Once vinegar was in hand, the possibilities multiplied. It was used to pickle vegetables, onions, cabbage, even carrots, extending their lives well beyond harvest. Slices of turnip or green herbs soaked in brine and vinegar became little jars of insurance for winter. In the absence of lemons or exotic acids, vinegar was the brightener. It cut through the fattiness of pork, gave depth to broth, and made a cold plate of lentils or beans taste fresh again. In the medicine chest, too, vinegar earned its place. Folk believed it could purify wounds, prevent plague, and draw out fever. Rags soaked in vinegar were wrapped around heads for headaches or pressed to skin for cooling. Some even mixed it with honey and herbs into an early tonic. Half health remedy, half superstition, all hope. And then there was cleaning. Long before soap became commonplace, vinegar was used to scrub pots, wipe down tables, and freshen wool cloaks. Its strong scent didn't just chase off mold and grime. It was believed to chase off evil as well. Best of all, vinegar never spoiled. If anything, it aged into itself, growing stronger, more complex. Stored in clay jugs or stoppered glass bottles, it kept for years in cool, dry pantries. It didn't ask for care, didn't go bad, and never overstayed its welcome. Vinegar may have puckered mouths and wrinkled noses, but it also preserved life, literally and figuratively. In a world where food was fleeting, vinegar was a guardian, sharp, scrappy, and eternal. Dried mushrooms. They arrived in autumn baskets, earthy and wild, smelling of rain-soaked bark and forest shadows. Mushrooms, soft, strange, and mysterious, were nature's quiet offering to those who knew where to look. But fresh, they were fleeting. Left out too long, they turned to mush or mold. So the peasant's wisdom was simple: preserve them with air and fire. Slice them thin, spread them near the hearth, and let time do the rest. What began as delicate fungi became dried treasure, wrinkled, weightless, and packed with flavor that could outlast winter itself. Foraging mushrooms was a local art. Not every peasant dared it, and for good reason. One wrong pick and supper turned to sickness. But those with the knowledge, often passed down in whispers from grandmother to grandchild, could spot edible gems beneath trees, tucked in mossy hollows, or clinging to fallen logs. Chanterelle, morels, boletes, and field mushrooms were all fair game. Collected after rain and handled with care, they were taken home and dried slowly near the warmth of the hearth, strung on twine or laid on mesh baskets to allow the air to move through them. Once dried, they shrank into little curls of umami-rich magic. Feather-light, they took up almost no space, yet added depth to every pot they touched. Toss a handful into a bubbling stew, and the scent would shift, suddenly deeper, richer, almost meaty. Mushrooms brought that elusive something to dishes that otherwise leaned heavily on beans, grains, and roots. They didn't spoil. In fact, they improved in storage. Kept in linen sacks or clay jars away from moisture, dried mushrooms could last a year or more. No salt needed, no vinegar, no root cellar, just time and patience. When the snow covered the fields and nothing grew for miles, a few dried mushrooms could bring the memory of the forest back to the pot. They were also prized enough to be traded. A small bundle of well-dried mushrooms might be bartered for eggs, herbs, or even a piece of cheese. In some regions, they were steeped in warm broth and eaten plain on days of fasting or mourning, a quiet, earthy comfort. Mushrooms were never a staple crop, but they were a secret weapon, a forager's prize, a cook's hidden strength. In every chewy bite, there was forest and fire, memory and muscle, and long after the trees had gone bare, their flavor lingered. Chestnuts. When the leaves fell crisp and gold and the air turned sharp with the smell of wood smoke, the chestnuts started dropping. You could hear them before you saw them, plinking off branches, rustling through leaves, cracking out of their spiny shells like secrets waiting to be gathered. For the medieval peasant, chestnuts weren't just autumn's gift. They were a lifeline hidden in the forest, rich in starch, easy to store, and endlessly adaptable. Unlike acorns, which needed soaking to remove bitterness, chestnuts could be eaten with only a bit of roasting, and they roasted beautifully. Tossed into embers or laid on a flat stone near the fire, their papery skins would split with a sigh and reveal soft golden flesh, sweet, nutty, and deeply satisfying. On cold nights, a pouch of roasted chestnuts warmed both hands and bellies. But chestnuts weren't just for snacking. They were ground into flour, a soft, slightly sweet powder that made hearty gruels, thickened stews, and could be kneaded into rustic breads or dumplings. Chestnut flour was especially prized in mountainous regions where grain was hard to grow, but chestnut trees thrived. In those places, they weren't a luxury. They were the pantry. Collected in great woven baskets, chestnuts were dried carefully, often in the attic or a loft where air could circulate. Some were strung and hung like garlic. Others were smoked gently to drive out moisture. Once dried, they could be kept for a year or longer, tucked into linen sacks or wooden chests, ready to be ground or boiled when needed. Their high carbohydrate content made them a vital filler food during the hardest stretches of the year, especially when grain supplies ran low. Chestnuts were even used as barter. A peasant might trade a sack for salt or offer a basket as a humble wedding gift. In some folk traditions, they were thought to bring luck or fertility, and roasted chestnuts were served on feast days as a simple, honest treat. They weren't flashy, but they were deeply nourishing. A bowl of mashed chestnuts with a bit of honey and lard could pass for pudding. Mixed with herbs and garlic, they made a kind of paste that turned flatbread into something memorable. In every forested corner of medieval Europe, chestnuts dropped quietly into the leaves like coins into a purse, and the wise knew to gather them, not just for warmth or sweetness, but for survival. Hemp seeds. Tiny, unassuming, and often overlooked, hemp seeds were one of the quietest powerhouses in the medieval peasant's diet. Round as a bead, soft gray or greenish-brown in hue, they looked like little more than bird feed to the modern eye. But in a world where calories were precious, meat was rare, and fats were hard-won, hemp seeds offered something extraordinary: protein, oil, and shelf stability wrapped in a plant that grew like a weed. Hemp was everywhere in medieval Europe. It was planted in fields, along fence lines, and even in monastery gardens. The stalks gave fiber for rope, sails, and rough cloth. The leaves were sometimes brewed into bitter tonics, but the seeds? They were gathered, dried, and eaten, a simple, nourishing food that kept through the longest winter without complaint. Once harvested, the seeds were threshed and winnowed, then dried until they were hard and dry to the tooth. Peasants stored them in sacks, baskets, or clay jars, often high on a pantry shelf where mice couldn't easily get to them. As long as they stayed dry and cool, they'd last for a year or more. No spoilage, no rot, just quiet endurance. Hemp seeds could be eaten raw in a pinch, but most often they were toasted in a pan or ground into a coarse meal. This meal was stirred into porridges, added to barley gruel, or even pressed into little cakes with water and a bit of salt. Mixed with dried fruits or honey on feast days, they became a kind of rustic energy bar. Chewy, oily, and surprisingly rich. When pressed, the seeds yielded an oil, dark, grassy, and strong-smelling. It wasn't as long-lasting as animal lard or tallow, but it was precious in its own right. Hemp oil was used for cooking, especially in times of religious fasting when animal fats were forbidden. It also lit lamps, greased tools, and even softened skin. A single crop of hemp could feed, clothe, and light a household. Despite their modest size, hemp seeds packed a nutritional punch. Full of essential fatty acids, protein, and fiber, they were especially prized during lean times. A spoonful stirred into hot broth or barley stew gave the kind of sustenance that carried a farmhand through a long day's labor. There wasn't much poetry around hemp seeds, no songs or legends, but in peasant kitchens, they were trusted, useful, practical. They didn't spoil, didn't mold, and didn't need tending once dried. Just a scoop, a bit of heat, and a warm bowl. Hemp seeds were the food of realists, of people who knew the value of every handful and how to stretch the smallest things into something lasting. And in that way, they mirrored the peasants themselves, humble, resourceful, and enduring. Mead. Open a dusty clay bottle sealed with wax and pour out a stream of liquid the color of golden sunlight. Let it catch the light. Thick, slow, shimmering. Bring it to your nose. Sweet, floral, with a whisper of wild herbs and old wood. Take a sip, and the warmth spreads, soft and slow like a good memory. This is mead, the drink of long winters, sacred halls, and quiet celebrations. In the medieval world, mead wasn't just a drink. It was a ritual, a gift from the bees, and a rare sweetness that, when made right, never expired. Made from just honey, water, and thyme, mead was one of the oldest and most enduring fermented drinks known to humankind. It predates wine, predates beer, predates even written language. For medieval peasants, it was rare, but never unreachable. A jar of honey from a neighbor's hive, a pot of clean water, and the patience to let nature do its work were all it took to make a drink fit for kings and commoners alike. Honey was the true star of the process. Sticky, fragrant, and nearly eternal, it was dissolved in water and left to sit in a warm corner. If yeast was added, the fermentation came quicker. If not, the wild yeasts floating in the air took over, slow, steady, and unpredictable. The bubbling began. The scent changed. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. And when the mead was ready, it was strained, bottled, and sealed. Some peasants drank it young, cloudy, slightly sour with a light buzz. Others let it age, hidden in cool cellars where the sweetness mellowed and the drink turned clear and deep like amber sap. The beauty of mead was in its longevity. A well-sealed bottle could last for years, even decades, growing more complex with every passing season. In a time when most drinks spoiled quickly, mead endured. It wasn't an everyday drink. That was left to ale or cider. Mead was for something more. It was for births, weddings, feast days, and holy festivals. It was poured at harvest celebrations and sipped on long winter nights when the snow howled outside and the fire crackled low. It was the first toast at a hand fasting, the last drink shared by old friends. It was sacred in its way, a link to something older and sweeter than the world seemed to offer most days. Even in the humblest homes, mead held a special place. A small jug set aside, hidden in a dark cupboard, brought out once or twice a year. Families passed down mead-making knowledge like a quiet spell, how to stir it with a wooden spoon, how to taste for readiness, how to seal it with beeswax, and trust that it would hold. Mead also carried with it a sense of story. It was mentioned in ballads and legends, said to fill the horns of Viking warriors and the goblets of saints. In Anglo-Saxon poems, mead halls were places of gathering and power, where warriors pledged loyalty and poets sang of glory. Even the church gave it a nod, using it in religious rites or in the making of medicinal tonics with herbs like thyme or yarrow. For peasants, it was rarely fancy, but it was always meaningful, and it had one quality that made it especially beloved in the medieval world. It didn't go bad, sealed tight, stored cool. It lasted. When so much food turned sour, moldy, or mealy, mead aged gracefully. It gave a little sweetness when sweetness was hard to come by. And so, in that final sip of golden mead, on a cold evening, with the wind rattling the shutters and the fire glowing low, there was more than just fermented honey. There was comfort, memory, celebration, a taste of the wild and the sacred, caught in a bottle and kept for when it was truly needed. Mead wasn't just a drink. It was time preserved, sweetness saved, and hope made liquid. So here we are, standing at the edge of the medieval pantry, the candle burning low and the last embers crumbling in the hearth. We've peered into crocks of lard and sauerkraut, run our fingers across dusty sacks of beans and barley, lifted lids on old wooden barrels, and uncorked a bottle of mead saved for a midwinter's night. 25 foods, not glamorous, not grand, but good. Good in the truest sense of the word. Reliable, honest, built to last. The medieval peasant didn't have luxury, but they had knowledge, passed down in calloused hands and murmured instructions, never written, but always remembered. They didn't stockpile because it was trendy. They stockpiled because survival demanded it. A root cellar wasn't quaint, it was a shield against hunger. A rope of onions wasn't decoration, it was security. Each food was a thread in the fabric of daily life, tough, time-tested, and quietly miraculous in its ability to endure. Think for a moment about what that meant, to take a harvest's fleeting bounty and make it last, not just days or weeks, but through snow, sickness, and famine. They dried, they smoked, they salted, they pickled. They coaxed flavor from time and safety from decay, and they didn't waste a thing. In every kitchen, the scraps became something else: broth, bait, feed, fuel. Even the air smelled of intention: brine and ash, vinegar and smoke, flour and old wood. These weren't luxury items tucked away for the future. They were lifelines. Each jar and sack was a promise that tomorrow could still include supper. A winter with dried apples and fermented cabbage wasn't indulgent, it was insurance. A slab of salted pork meant you'd made it through the last slaughter and had something to show for it. A wheel of cheese aging slowly in the dark meant your household knew how to plan, how to wait, and how to honor the passing of seasons with patience. And maybe that's the part that lingers long after the list is done: the patience. The quiet, humble acceptance that food takes time, that preserving is an act of foresight, that eating, at its best, is not hurried or hollow. but grounded in work and weather and the natural turning of the earth. These foods weren't fast, they weren't convenient, but they were alive with meaning, and they held a kind of memory that outlived even the people who made them. You can still find echoes of those practices today, in home canning, in root cellars turned suburban, in families who save seeds and dry herbs and make bread from scratch. And when you crack open a jar of pickles or drop dried beans into a soup pot, you're not just cooking, you're remembering. You're doing what peasants did 1,000 years ago, preparing, preserving, providing. There's a deep comfort in knowing that some things never change, that honey will always keep, that garlic hung just right will dry and wait, that beans once dried will still bloom in boiling water and feed a family with the same quiet pride they did in 1325. These foods aren't just historical curiosities. They're instructions, left for us like notes in the margins of time. They teach us how to live simply, store wisely, and eat with reverence. They remind us that good food doesn't need a barcode or a chef's signature. Sometimes it just needs salt, a dark room, and a little patience. Sometimes it just needs to last. So the next time you open your pantry and find a can of beans, a jar of vinegar, a sack of oats, pause. Take a breath. Think of the hands that once gathered, prepared, and stored these same staples in candlelight and cold air, with little more than instinct and grit. And know that in doing the same, in even a small way, you're honoring a legacy of survival, resourcefulness, and faith in the future. Because food isn't just what we eat, it's what we keep, what we save, what we pass on. And these 25 never-expiring foods, they're not just about the past, they're about how we live, today, tomorrow, and through every long winter to come.